So in chapter 6, we're going to explore Adlerian family therapy. So Adler was the first major theorist to actually practice family therapy. So he had set up some clinics around the country and invited children and their parents to come in so that he could work with them, but also really get an understanding of what goes on within families. But he focused a lot on the parent-child relationship. And then this evolved over time into this theory that's now called Adlerian family therapy. And so the basic premise of this is that there are these negative, repetitive cycles of behavior and interaction between parents and children or spouses, and these cycles of patterns of behavior are really based on these ideas of false goals. And so individual family members have these goals that they assume are um, within the family, or assume that other family members might have. And so they fall into these negative, repetitive patterns of interaction where, for example, an argument between two spouses might start out about um, forgetting to take out the trash, and then it becomes about the laundry and the kids and all of these other things. And so something that starts out, it doesn't matter what the argument starts out about, it always ends up being about the same things in the end. And so in that example, maybe a spouse has a false goal of getting the other spouse to be more attentive, or wanting to have more help, or the goal of being more appreciated. And the way that they're going about trying to fulfill this goal is by picking fights with their spouse about everything. And so, according to Adler, these patterns of behavior will continue until someone, a therapist, comes in, observes this behavior, and then makes some kind of intervention in order to correct these patterns and realign these goals. And so, some common criticisms of this particular theory is that Adler based it on this assumption that families are generally really similar. And so the problems that exist within the family that are driving these false goals can be generalized based on cultural or social identity. So based on the cultural group to which the family adheres or identifies or belongs to, you can make some assumptions about what the typical problems are going to be. So that's where you get into this trap of, oh, all Asian families have issues with this type of thing, or oh, all middle class families have problems with the men being overbearing, or whatever it might be. So you get into some stereotyping at times. And so this theory isn't as culturally sensitive as some more recent theories may be. Um, but essentially, at the basis, Adlerian family therapy explores the motivation of family members and how those motivations and goals play out in their interactions with each other. So Adler describes family systems as constellations. And it's the same idea that family members are connected to each other and impact each other, um, both parents and children. So Adler talks about development in that individuals develop and are kind of molded by their nurturing that they receive and the social learning that they receive from the interactions with people around them. These are people in the family, but also people that they may interact with in school or in friend groups. So children are constantly evolving and developing and changing as they're exposed to new people and developing new understandings of the world, which we know is the case from developmental theory. And so based on this, Adler talks about children as active agents in a family. So what that means is that it's really the children that define the family constellation, and that they change the dynamics in a family as they grow and develop and interpret life in new ways. So as they learn new things about the world, they change the family constellation as a result. in the way that they're interacting with their parents and their siblings. And so Adler talks about parents as the leaders of the family, but really says that children are the ones that have the greatest impact on what happens within a family because they really are the active agents of change in that constellation. And so Adler says that parents need some help because, generally speaking, adults are really poorly trained to parent children, and he believed that going to therapy was a critical aspect of learning appropriate parenting because otherwise adults just fall into patterns of doing whatever their parents did, whether those were positive or helpful things or not. And so Adler was really a fan of these psychoeducational sessions. And so he'd bring in families and work with them, but work with them in open sessions so that others could observe and learn. And so his idea being that from working with this one family, other parents might learn more appropriate parenting strategies. So it's kind of a unique thing that Adler used to do. And so he described families as either functional or dysfunctional. Things are working or things are not working. And so Adler said that a lot of times families might act functional in public and be able to keep it together when they're outside of the house, but really are dysfunctional, and this dysfunction comes out in private when they're interacting in the home. Adler also talked a lot about birth order. He considered the order in which children were born to be very important and to have a lot of influence on how a family interacts and the roles that people play within a family. So he really spent a lot of time learning about the birth order of parents, the birth order of children, and made a lot of assumptions about the roles that they played based on this birth order. Adler talked about how, based on this birth order and based on parenting styles, together families develop these atmospheres or climates. And so these atmospheres or climates are ways that support how members of the family are currently interacting and influencing each other. So these can be really positive and healthy atmospheres, or they can be really unhealthy atmospheres. It really depends on what the family patterns are. And so these atmospheres are things that a therapist might pay attention to in order to conceptualize and interpret things in the family. And then the goal of counseling might be to create a more positive or supportive or healthy atmosphere for the family. And so Adler said that a lot of times these atmospheres can be observed in the interactions between parents because parental style really influences the type of atmosphere that gets developed in a family. Adler also talked about values. He said that families develop values to guide and influence decision making, and those become really important in the way that a family develops. And so when parents are able to agree on values, these get passed down to children, and all of the decisions and interactions that happen with a family would then be in accordance to values or not, and not acting in accordance to family values can create a source of conflict in families. So Adler said often parents develop these values based on whatever their parents taught them, and then as they pass these on to children, as they grow up and become parents, these values are then passed on to their children as well. So Adler also talked about this idea of mistaken goals and this idea that children use behavior as a way of pursuing life goals. And so Adler said that somewhere along the way, children might get a little mixed up in what they need, and so they develop these mistaken goals as a way of pursuing these inappropriate things or these things that are not really what they need developmentally. And he gives some examples of attention-seeking behavior or a power struggle with a parent or seeking revenge on someone who has harmed them, or expressing some sort of inadequacy or disability. And so with these being goals, Adler describes misbehaving children as simply misguided attempts at achieving goals for what they need. And so parents can just correct this behavior by becoming aware of first noting the behavior, and then discovering what that goal is that the child's trying to achieve, and then what do they need that they're not getting that they're trying to pursue these goals. And so within Adlerian therapy, the way that we would address these issues is ultimately trying to reestablish and support the parents to be more effective leaders of the family. So that's where Adler talks about parenting skills and psychoeducation. So really trying to realign the constellation where the parents are the head of the family and then the children are beneath the parents, and that they're all complementing and supporting each other, but the parents are clearly the leaders of the family, as opposed to the children driving things with their mistaken goals and their behavior. And so, an important aspect of the therapeutic process then is to understand everyone's place in the family. And so the therapist needs to evaluate the interactions between the family members and really determine where everybody's place is and where it needs to be, and then how to shift roles and establish new goals in order to be able to do this. It's also a goal to discover the motivations of family members. So everyone in the family, in theory, has some kind of motivation driving their behavior and their patterns of interactions with each other within the constellation. And so once we discover what those motivations are, we may be able to help develop healthier ways of pursuing those things, or maybe they're misguided motivations that need to be realigned. And so the end goal for therapy would be to ultimately modify the motivations of the family members so that you create this constellation and atmosphere that supports positive interactions that are supportive of each other, as opposed to negative interactions which don't help anyone meet their needs or goals at all. So Nickel was a researcher that came and built on the Adlerian model and really tried to explain how motivation worked in the interactions between adults and children and families. And so they really talked about how every interaction between family members really served some kind of purpose, and that at the core they were really based on these rules that we develop through social learning and through values in our families about what we should and should not be doing. And so these rules of interaction, particularly for adults, then would play into the different interactions that they have with the family, which are really characterized by the purpose of the function. And so looking at how behavior, which sometimes can be positive and sometimes can be negative, really serves the purposes of fulfilling the rules. And those come out in the actions and emotions in the interactions of the family members. So adults have these rules, they make decisions in alignment with the rules, and so these actions and emotions that come out in therapy are really a reflection of adults' desires and need to fulfill the rules. And so those would then impact children who develop these rules based on what they learned from their parents and would follow along the same lines. So these change as children develop and kind of gather these new understandings of the world. The rules might change a bit for them as they get older, but they really tend, according to Adler, they internalize the values and rules of their parents and parenting styles similar to what their parents had done. And so adults and children and families both have these sets of rules. Sometimes they're the same, sometimes they're not. And they're both interacting with each other in ways that serve as a way to fulfill the rules in positive or negative ways. And so when dysfunction occurs, it's that these rules are disaligned or the rules are not conducive to the needs of the family members. And so the functions that are being fulfilled by the actions and emotions are negative, and that's what comes out in the therapy. And so the therapist's job is really to then go in and examine these meta messages, these deeper rooted rules and family values and expectations, so that they could get a better idea of what the needs of the family members are, and they can better align the rules with the needs of the family members so that these actions and emotions are more positive and supportive of the functions they're trying to serve in the first place. So then the techniques for Adlerian therapy first start with the therapist joining with the family. So different from object relations theory, the therapist does actually connect with the family and seeks to be a part of the family constellation, at least for the duration of the therapy relationship. And so the relationship between the family and the therapist are really more on an equal ground and are based on respect for the therapist and their role, but also respect for all of the family members and making all the family members feel present in the room. So once the therapist has built this rapport with the family, then they can start to assess what's really going on. And so they might do a lifestyle assessment. And this is a process of understanding how each family member connects to the whole constellation, and then how that connects with the view that each family member has of themselves, their own unique perspective, and then how interactions outside of the family at school or at work or friendships or other relationships are impacting their view of their role within the family, and how those might be informing the goals that they have in the interactions with family members. Adler also talks about the importance of early memories and how those early memories really shape your values and your motivations and your relationship with other members of your family. And so Adler really emphasized the importance of spending time interviewing each family member and really understanding who they are, how they connect with the world, and especially exploring early recollections. So anywhere from birth to maybe 8 or 9, because those are really influential, according to Adler, in development of your value system and how that might play out with children considering some of those mistaken goals, and then with parents in some of their parenting styles. So these early recollections are really key to understanding the family constellation. So once we kind of have an idea and conceptualize the family within Adlerian family therapy, we then move on to problem descriptions and goal identification. And so this is really a process of understanding the daily interactions and patterns among the family members, what that looks like. So trying to really parse out and understand what's going on, what those meta messages are, what's going on underneath all of these interactions and patterns of behavior that are happening within the family and their interactions. And so wanting to ultimately work towards a goal of uncovering mistaken goals that need to be addressed in the counseling relationship. And so part of this process might look like the therapist asking the family to describe a typical day and asking multiple members to describe a typical day, so that the therapist gets multiple perspectives and really understands how each family member plays into the typical patterns. But this really, in theory, would give the therapist an idea about the different interactions and roles that are happening over time. And so not just leaning on understanding of what's going on in the therapy room, because those interactions might look different once the therapist joins the family and changes the constellation. It's important to understand a typical day or the typical patterns of that family outside of a counseling relationship that brought them in the first place. So really, what is going on that put the family into chaos? Adler talked about how it's important to interview the parents to really understand their role in things and their parenting styles and the family values, but it's also really important to interview the children. And so any kind of idea that a therapist has about what's going on in a family really has to be confirmed by interviewing the children and understanding the children's perspective of what's going on. And the goal of that is to be able to identify those mistaken goals that children are enacting with their problem behavior that's causing conflict with their parents, and then being able to describe this in a way that's understandable for the children and for the parents. So being able to determine these things and then sharing them with the family so that they can start moving forward in recognition of these patterns and being able to change these patterns over time. And so once we've gone through that whole process of really understanding what's going on in the family, then we can start reorienting and re-educating the family. And so now that we have these patterns, we've identified the mistaken goals, we've identified how the family values are playing into all of this in the constellation, we can then reorient the family. So redirecting families from their current patterns of behavior and helping them develop more functional patterns of behavior that'll better meet the needs of all of the family members in a healthy way. And ideally, within the family constellation, this would then also help establish the parents as leaders in the family again, instead of the children directing um, the parents' reactions and influencing the pattern that they have with their parents through those mistaken goals that they were trying to solve through their problemed behavior. And part of this process is also considering that you need to make sure that you're validating the family in the struggle. And so, just like any other therapeutic relationship, we don't want the families to feel like they're the only ones having issues, to feel like they're crazy for having these kinds of problems. And so, a big piece of that is normalizing family experiences. So, helping the family to understand that everyone has issues, everyone has these patterns of behavior that may not be as healthy and supportive as we'd like them to be. And so that part of the therapeutic relationship is really to be able to do that, and that's normal, that's okay. Part of it's also reframing, so being able to use your experience and your training as a counselor to be able to give the family a new perspective and conceptualize these patterns of behavior that they may not be aware of, because often these patterns of behavior are unconscious or subconscious. And so being able to provide that perspective through reframing things for the family is really helpful in being able to bring awareness to these patterns so that you can address them more directly with the family and be able to create a more functional constellation.